Hello, hello. I hope everybody is dialed in and can hear me. My name's Jeremy Brown. I am the Chief Executive of Canning House, which, for those of you who don't know, is the principal forum here in Britain, in London, for discussing relations between the UK and Latin America. And we have a big range of events covering politics, elections, business, commerce, trade, culture, education, you name it. We are in the business of strengthening, deepening, developing relations between Britain and Latin America. It's also exciting for me because we have just moved into a brand new office here in central London. And this is the first event that we've done from that new office. So I am well aware that for you watching on the screen, it makes no difference where I'm sitting. But for me, it feels different because I've never done a webinar sitting in this room before. We've only had the furniture for a couple of days. So this is a new version of Canning House. And we will do hundreds and hundreds of events, but we will always say that this was the first event that we did from this new office of ours. So it's good that we're doing a slightly interesting and different subject, the Mariana Dam Disaster. People have said to me, why are you covering this? Because it is a bit unconventional for us. As I say, the last webinar I think we did was on the Paraguayan presidential elections, and we tend to be a bit more operating in those sort of spaces. But clearly, it's a seismic, significant event in recent history of Brazil, of South America, that has ramifications and implications, most obviously for the communities directly affected, but also has a sort of UK LATAM aspect to it in terms of the aftermath of the disaster. And it was felt by a number of people that it would be an interesting area to explore. I think I said this to the speakers and just so that the audience is mindful of this as well, that we're not really, we're an impartial organization. We're not setting ourselves up as the great arbiters or authority on matters of this sort. So I think we're not really in the business today necessarily of trying to heavy-handedly apportion blame or point fingers. I think I'm more interesting in what we can learn, maybe looking forward as much, if not more than looking back, being reflective, being measured, and thinking about what the consequences and ramifications are of this sizable disaster many years on, as yet unresolved and still a live issue, and therefore worthy of discussion. In terms of the format, we have four excellent speakers. Each one is going to lay out their view, their perspective for, well, I've said roughly 7 or 8 minutes. So give you a sort of flavor. So we'll have between the speakers about half an hour, a bit more than half an hour, setting out the scene about what they think about the disaster and its aftermath. And then we'll have a discussion. And I'll say to everybody that, I think there's facility to pose questions. I can't promise that I'll get to every question. Please be mindful of legal restraints. I've said that to the speakers. That would be true of people posting questions as well. We should tread with a degree of caution. But I'm keen that should be a sort of fluid conversation, not something sort of really rigid. So it may be that, we try and take the conversation in natural directions. It may be that not every speaker answers every question. We try and keep it moving, and we try and cover as much ground as possible and try and make it as interesting for everybody watching as possible, because we're grateful to all of you for joining us and taking an interest in what we do at Canning House. And we are scheduled, it's just after 3 o'clock in the afternoon UK time now, and we're scheduled to finish by 4:15. And I will try and keep to that schedule, because I know that people dialing in have got other things to do with their days as well as to listen to this, and I want to be respectful of your time. Right. Thank you again, everybody. We've got really a good number of people who have joined us for this conversation. So let's get to our first speaker, who is Ana Carolina from Pogust Goodhead, originally a Brazilian, and passionate about the social impact of litigation finance and the wider ramifications of this case. So, Anna Carolina, the floor is yours. We'll be interested in hearing your contribution.
Thank you very much. My intention today is just, as you were saying, to take a forward approach. Of course, we will revisit what happened, what this case is about. But also, I would like to take this opportunity to be prospective. How can we benefit from the table that we have here, from the audience that we have here, to improve governance practice in the field, and how we can make lives safer? That's my intention. I also take, it is true that I am Brazilian and passionate about the access, the impact, the social impact of litigation, collective litigation funding, but I also take a very pragmatic approach in terms of understanding the economics behind all of that. It's true that it's difficult, I would say rather impossible, to talk about how this case shapes or is shaping corporate governance best practice without understanding what is it about. So what are we talking about? Many of you, some of you might know what we are talking about when we are referring to the Mariana Dam collapse, but I think that we have to go back around 8 years in time when the disaster catastrophic event happened, and picture how was it. It was a Thursday around this time that we have now in the UK, 3:40 precisely, 15th of November 2015. Sorry, 5th of November 2015, meaning that almost summertime in Brazil, probably a sunny time, sunny weather, just like you have now in the UK, when the disaster struck, forever altering the lives of those in the region and leaving a lasting impact on the environment. A tailing dam operated in joint venture by two very known mining companies, BHP and Vale, collapsed, liberating 50 tons of toxic mud that traveled along the Rio Doce. To give you a full perspective of what is 50 million tons, we are talking about around 20,000 Olympic pools of toxic mud flowing down an entire river that is as big as the Thames River that crosses London, that it will be as big as the travel between Edinburgh and London. The toxic mud ran through this entire way, going through all various villages, municipalities, and causing several devastation in the middle of that. The tragically event could have been avoided. This is what our clients claim. It happened as partially as a consequence of the insistency of the companies to be maintaining their profitable results in respect of the fact of the price of the iron ore was collapsing at the time. Not talking much more about the case itself and talking about what are the reflects of this to corporate governance. Not talking about how it could be avoided or how the governance, the governance policies in place at the time were potent enough or not. The idea here is to discuss what of this catastrophic event that took the life of 19 people and devastated entire cities like Mariana, Bento Rodrigues, Barra Longa, Governador Valadares, that might seem so distant to you, but it was totally devastated by the event. How can this disaster be reflected in better governance practices? Not only talking about better governance practices to the respective companies related to this catastrophic events, or not only better governance practice for the mining sector or for multinationals. We are talking about better governance practices for the entire system of companies. We are talking about bringing more safety, not only for the employees of those companies, people that work on the mining fields or on operation facilities and industry plants, but we are talking about safety for all the community. If you consider the environmental effects and the impacts that this catastrophic event of the tailing dam collapse had in the entire river and all the shore, and we add to that the challenge that we all as human beings are facing now with climate change, I am safe to say that we all as a society were affected by the aftermath of that. Talking about better governance policies affects, therefore, the livelihood of all of us. Also, we have to consider not the negative externalities that this malfunctioning corporate governance had on the society, but also its economic burden that affects other stakeholders, including the investors, shareholders, and creditors of those companies, that are those that actually carry the risk, carry the financial risk of those decisions that are taken most likely at the board level of those companies. Better better corporate governance means better compliance, means better safety in terms of economic returns for the investors, and also better control and safety for the entire society. That's what I would like to talk. Understand that this is not only about making safe one specific population in a city far, far, far away from us that we don't even know the name. We are talking about the safety of the entire planet. And even if we want to take a very economic approach of that, we are talking about safety for the shareholders and the investors. We are talking about considering the corporate governance as the G of the ESG risk metrics when analyzing the returns of investment, of financial investments. And we are talking about making this safer for all of us. It is important here, before I pass to the other speakers, to also make clear that I would like to make differentiations here. So here in this panel, I'm not talking about the justice for my clients. I'm talking here about strengthening the governance for the entire society. So I would ask you to please take me as a position as someone that is, as our president of the table just said, prospective approach rather than a retrospective. I'm not here defending my clients.
Thank you. Thank you. Perfect contribution. Set the scene. Interesting, informative, exactly the length of what would you ask for. Thank you very much. Right, our second speaker, Stephen Barry, is the Deputy Director of Ethics and Engagement at the Church of England Pensions Board, and is also able to provide on-the-ground insights from Brazil, having visited the country in the immediate aftermath of the disaster and seen a lot of its effects for himself. So, Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thank you to Canning House for inviting me to speak. I spent some formative months in Argentina and Brazil 20 years ago, so it's very good to continue thinking about Latin America. I'm going to speak today from the perspective of an investor that has a diversified portfolio in the pension fund that we invest on behalf of 42,000 beneficiaries. And we invest across the mining sector and across other industries for whom the mining sector is a significant supplier. In fact, our view is that one can't avoid the mining sector and shouldn't avoid the mining sector. It plays a systemically important role in the global economy, and an important role that's going to increase in the future. Mining is necessary for the transition to a low carbon economy. So we should expect increased demand at a time where we're focusing on lower grade ores. So the mining waste, the tailings, that was the cause, that was the facility that failed in Mariana and in Brumadinho, and before that at Mount Polly, and before that at Stava, and before that at Cadia, and before that in the UK Many people have memories of Aberfan, which was a coal ash heap. These failures relate to mining waste, and we should expect an increasing load of mining waste needing to be stored in tailings facilities. Increased demand because of the low carbon transition. The International Energy Agency predict more than 400% increases in some metals and minerals, including lithium and cobalt, relative to 2018 supply levels, in order for us to achieve a below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels of warming. So the mineral demand is going to increase. The ore grades are going to reduce, so there are going to be more waste material that needs to be stored, and needs to be stored safely with good governance and good business practices. I've got 3 reflections about corporate governance, if you can hear me over the sirens. 3 reflections of corporate governance that I wanted to offer. One in relation to, specifically in relation to the Mariana disaster, and 2 in relation to both the Mariana and the Brumadinho disaster, which prompted a significant wave of investor interest and action and engagement with and alongside the mining sector. So firstly, in relation to Mariana, that disaster focused investor attention on joint venture structures, on the responsibility of the kind of the parent companies, the joint venture partners, and their relationship with the operating entity, in this case, Samarco. While the kind of parent companies had board members and had influence, our view is that it was relatively rare for that influence to be brought to bear in meaningful ways on environmental, social and governance topics. And this is a general point across the industry, not just in relation to Mariana. Rare for that influence to be brought to bear in joint ventures. So that creates a challenge, an agency problem challenge, if you like, because the responsibility flows upwards to those parent companies when the governance is perhaps not as robust as you might find with a subsidiary. That interest in joint ventures has cashed out in terms of the details of investor disclosure requests of mining companies. So in 2019, in an investor disclosure request to the entire mining sector, that's over 700 listed entities, there was a request that companies disclose not only their operated sites, but also their non-operated joint venture sites as well, subject to that investor disclosure. So investors have pushed for increased transparency and indirectly, through the transparency, improved governance of NOJV sites. So that's the first point. The second point around corporate governance, and this is a response to the series of tailings facility failures that we've seen over time, is an investor coalition of over 100 institutions with more than $23 trillion of assets under management was convened in 2019 and engaged the industry. I mentioned the disclosure request that was sent to the entire mining industry. That received a huge amount of response from the mining sector. About 80% of the mining industry by market capitalization responded to that request. And that's quite unusual in terms of a responsible investment initiative. And a huge number of disclosures were made. And 1,800 tailings facilities are now contained in the Global Tailings Portal that's publicly available, free to access. And we hope and believe improves the scrutiny in civil society and among investors of these sites. Although disclosure wasn't the end of the story, investors, along with ICMM, the industry body, a body which both BHP and Vale are members of, investors alongside ICMM and the UN Environment Programme set in motion a global tailings review to improve the governance of tailings storage facilities. That global tailings review, under an independent chair and with an expert panel and wide multi-stakeholder consultation in 5 continents, produced the Global Industry Standard on Tailings Management back in 2020. And that global industry standard on tailings management, which includes governance, includes a focus on community members right at the heart of it, engaging with community members and human rights due diligence, that has been picked up by investors and incorporated into our corporate governance related engagement. So at the pensions board where I work, if a company CEO, publicly listed company CEO, has not declared their support for the GASTM, then we vote against them at the company AGM. If they fail to respond to our request for support, we vote against them at the company AGM. And when we announced that policy back in January, when was it? 2022, a number of large asset managers stated that that was also going to be their policy and it was being incorporated into their engagement. And those are some big names, including Invesco, Federated Hermes, and BlackRock, the largest asset manager in the world. So this is significant increase in investor stewardship and engagement on the topic of safety within the mining industry, and against a well-defined standard that was created alongside and with industry, alongside and with a multi-stakeholder process and the UN Environment Programme. So that if we're looking for a good, globally applicable and practical standard for governance, the GASTM is one that I'd recommend further attention. Finally, remedy. I think there are not that many examples in the world of a very significant disaster caused by a publicly listed entity. And our view is that the world's eyes are on the companies involved, and the Renova Foundation in particular, and whether and how they carry the confidence of the local stakeholders in remedy and remediation. Obviously, it's the third part of the Ruggie principles. Now, I visited Mariana 6 weeks ago and Brumadinho, and was impressed by the amount of effort that the Renova Foundation are putting into remediation across their 42 programs. I believe they've spent 1.4 billion reais on remedy so far, and 500,000 people are in line for compensation. It still remains to be seen. I think there's still a huge amount of work to be done in order for that foundation to carry the confidence of the local communities, in spite of the amount of work undertaken so far. And I found it striking from a governance point of view that the Renova Foundation has had a mandate to include 2 community representatives on their board since 2018, and those positions remain unfilled. That seems to be a fairly significant governance challenge for 5 years for 2 posts, which are the only community-related posts in the governing board, for those to remain empty. So in terms of corporate governance, I agree that this is absolutely critical in this instance and in the wider mining sector. We can't avoid mining, and in the future, I think we, both speaking as an investor and in terms of the macroeconomic picture of the role of mining in society, have a huge interest in making sure that mining is done well and done responsibly to high globally applicable standards in the interests of the climate transition. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you, Jeremy.
Stephen, thank you. Thank you. It was really sharp, insightful analysis. I'm partly interested because I worked for an asset management company for a while, and Anna Carolina mentioned ESG and the G bit of ESG. And I think it is interesting how people who manage huge volumes of assets deploy those mindful of the governance structures of the firms that they're investing money in, and how they can use that as a lever to bring about desirable outcomes. But we'll come to that in the conversation after the initial contribution. So our third of our 4 speakers is Jorge. Hello, welcome, Jorge Cardenas, who's dialing in from Mexico, I'm told. You come in from Mexico? That's good morning in Mexico, where he's based. And Jorge is the Americas Regional Manager at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. So he is going to give his perspective right now. Over to you, Jorge.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for the invitation. On behalf of Phil Bloomer, or Director at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. He's based actually in London. I'm quite happy to be here today. Yeah, so as you say, I'm the manager for the America continent. I have the pleasure to coordinate a team of about 20 staff members across America. I hope you notice that I don't use the term Americas because we believe that there is only one America, an America that covers all countries in this fascinating continent. The Business and Human Rights Resource Center, really quick to help you understand who we are, is an international NGO which collects data on the human rights impacts of about 10,000 companies worldwide, including some of your corporate members like Shell or Cemex in Mexico. In total, we have a global team of almost 90 members in about 36 countries. And what we do is we engage with transnational corporations, governments, and communities to urge them to share information publicly. So we take up alleged abuse quickly and directly with companies. So how do we do that? It's not that complicated. In order to reach out to companies, firstly, our team, by researchers, have to obtain information, and yeah, they have to obtain information from different sources. For this webinar, I was asked to focus on the role of the media. So for that, to reach out to companies, we obtain the information shared by the media, along with other more specific and research resources, like reports from the UN, NGOs, or academic institutions. So the role of the media for our work plays a key role. For us, it's about activate our team once the information is published by the media and brings the issue into the general public's attention. So we save the media information, and then we reach out to companies mentioned on such media outlets. So for instance, our researchers will try to find the correct contact point on the company's website, but also sometimes we already have the designated focal point from companies. Sometimes we don't, so we do our best to find the right person within the company that is mentioned on this article or on the news media. Normally, we provide about 2 weeks time period for companies to share with us their side of their story. For instance, in 2022, we made about almost 900 approaches to companies, asking them to respond to a specific human rights allegations. I had an image that I want to show you, which is our company response mechanism that we use. So this is an email, a template that we share to companies trying to reach out the information that we need. So you can see it. So I'm going to try to share it in the chat so you can take a look, see if it works really quick. So you can see it. And if not, then I can, yeah, because it's not working. I'll try to send it to Jeremy so maybe they can share it as a follow-up. But what you will see in the company response mechanism that we use is, first of all, we have to explain who we are. And then we show to the person of that company the resource where we obtain the information, and we give them the space in whatever format they want to use to share with us and to the website that we have the story or the explanation that they want to share with us. That's how it works. It's a very simple mechanism that we have, and it works very well. Just to give you an example, our global company response rate is about 60%. So that's why our website is the only global business and human rights knowledge hub, which delivers up-to-date and comprehensive news coverage. We have about 600 new pages a month across 10 languages. Just to give an example, and on this one, I'm gonna be able to share it on the link. This is how it looks, the company page we have for BHP. So I'm going to share it. I'm going to share it on the chat, so you can follow my conversation and guide you a little bit of what you can see on this website. Just give me a few seconds. So I'm going to share it on the chat. And for those who can do it, just please click on it. And this is how you're going to see the information that we have for BHP. Basically, you'll be able to see where that it belongs to the mining, oil, gas, and coal industry. That maybe you have located that the headquarters are based in Australia. You have the official website. Also, you have some explanations of some related companies. And the interesting part also is that from this company, we have a response rate of about 91%, which means that most of the time they will reply to us. As you might be aware, and if not, it is my duty to share that with you, the most controversial industries, whether it's the mining industry, the tobacco industry, the food industry, they tend to have a high response rate because it's good for their public relations strategy to give us response. So it's not strange to find that these companies from these very controversial industries do have a very high response rate. So that's what you see on the circle that tells you 91%. And also this company is related to 28 human rights defenders attacks, for instance. Also, you can see a little bit below if they have different policies in place about human rights due diligence, or if they are part of different initiatives from this industry. And then you will also find the different stories or items that we have published regarding the behavior of this company and the communities that this company might have affected. So I hope that was helpful for you to understand what is it that we do. Also, the last part of my conversation is for you to understand how those at work helps the global discussion on corporate accountability, especially coming from the Global South. So I was asked by the organizers to focus on that, and that's the last part of my conversation. As you can imagine, it does help a lot. As I mentioned before, our website is the only global business and human rights knowledge hub. So we deliver up-to-date and comprehensive news coverage. The information we have is shared publicly, so it's available to everyone, including human rights defenders, advocates, public officials, investors, investigative journalists. So our information is used on a daily basis at key forums and even during treaty negotiation process. So for instance, at this moment in different parts of the world, the United Nations is organizing regional forums on business and human rights. So our team and the communities that we represent, we take part of those negotiations to shape the programs of those forums and those conversations. Also, our team is currently also helping representing communities and shaping a little bit the process of the legally binding treaty on business and human rights, which is taking place at the United Nations Human Rights Council. Just to give you another example, members of our team are right now engaging at this moment with European Union officials, United Nations delegates, parliamentarians across the globe, representing the voice of the most affected communities by companies.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Is that okay?
Oh, yes.
Sorry,
yes.
I don't want to cut you off mid-sentence.
Oh, yes, Jeremy.
I thought you bring
yeah, I was about to finish, so yeah, that's good.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very interesting perspective. I should add, not as a rebuke to Jorge, but we did ask BHP and the Renova Foundation if they wish to participate. Of course, they're entirely within their rights not to. So that was an interesting perspective. But I suppose maybe I should add that we're not at Canning House assuming that and I'm not saying that you are saying this, that the mining firms or others have malign intentions. But obviously it's in everybody's interest, including theirs and their shareholders, which I think was the point that Anna Carolina made at the beginning, for them to demonstrate best practice and for organizations and individuals to play their legitimate part in seeking to try and hold them to high standards. That seems entirely reasonable and sensible to me. Right, thank you, Jorge. Our final speaker is Lee. Hello, Lee. Thank you for being patient. Professor Lee Payne. Professor Payne is a professor of sociology and Latin America at the University of Oxford, and has many other achievements under that umbrella to her name, which I won't list now because let's crack on. Over to you, Lee, for your reflections, please.
Thank you, Jeremy. Also, thank you, Chloe and Juan, and the Canning House in general for this opportunity to draw on our research at Oxford to discuss the lessons from the Mariana case. Together with what I'm going to refer to is a project that I carried out with my colleagues Gabriel Pereira from Argentina and Laura Bernal Bermudez from Colombia, to build a corporate accountability and transitional justice database. The database tracks corporate accountability for human rights violations carried out during dictatorships and armed conflicts in every country of the world, from the post-World War II era to the present. In fact, we're in the process of updating now for over the last couple of years. And I should add that much of that original data came from the BHRRC archive that Jorge just described. It's a fantastic archive, and I encourage you all to take a look at it. So from that research, we put together a book. And this is called Transitional Justice and Corporate Accountability from Below, Deploying Archimedes' Lever. This came out during the pandemic by Cambridge University Press in 2020. It's also available for free in Spanish, if you read Spanish, on the De Justicia in Colombia website, and I can provide you with that information if you'd like to take a look at it. I can't go into a lot of details from the book. What I want to do is talk about 3 sets of findings from our research that relate to the Mariana Dam case. And in specific terms, I want to address the question that we were given, which is what kind of lessons can we draw from the Mariana Dam case for thinking about corporate accountability corporate accountability for human rights violations. The 3 I'm going to talk about, the 3 lessons, are the importance of international pressure, the importance of a propitious, I guess we could call it, a favorable human rights context, and also the ability to overcome what we might call a veto power of business. And I know I'll be accused of being anti-business, which I am not. What I am anti is human rights violations. So keeping that clear is what can we do about business human rights violations? And beginning to talk about this issue of the importance of international pressure. Our findings show that this kind of case that Pogust Goodhead has brought is very, very rare. That is, using international courts, or in this case, foreign courts, to hold companies accountable for violations that occur elsewhere in another country. In our whole database, we only found 37 civil cases for accountability in foreign courts and 13 cases in foreign criminal courts. And the results of these cases are also do not indicate a very strong effect of these kinds of foreign cases. We had 0 adverse judgments in civil courts, and we only had 4 convictions in criminal courts across our full database. Now, keep in mind, these are for violations during dictatorships and armed conflicts, not all cases in the world. Where we do see the most dynamism is in domestic courts in the global south. And as Ana Carolina mentioned, this is an ongoing case in Brazil, as well as in the UK. This is very, very rare that this case from our database, that Brazil would pursue a case, the Brazilian courts would take this case forward. We have only 1 case in Brazil, and it's against Volkswagen. Volkswagen settled this case that was brought by the state prosecutor in Sao Paulo against the involvement of the company in arbitrary detention and torture of workers during the Brazilian dictatorship. And part of that innovative settlement was to create a fund to support investigations into other companies' violations during the dictatorship. And 2 of those cases, including one against Fiat, have been initiated as a result. So this case moved forward, the Volkswagen case moved forward largely because of international pressure in Germany. And this involves stockholder initiatives, labor alliances between Brazil and Germany, as well as German media pressure on the company. So one of the first lessons that I want to talk about in the case of the Mariana Dam case is this form of pressure for accountability in UK courts, and particularly the role that Pogust Goodhead has played in amplifying the demands from citizens in Brazil for some form of accountability for these violations. The second point is about human rights context. I'm wondering, I've been thinking about this case and whether one thing that could explain it is a kind of new human rights context. And I'm probably being overly optimistic about a new human rights context, but let's go with this for the moment. It's an optimistic day. In the wake of the shrinking role of US courts that had been using alien tort statutes to hold companies accountable for in US courts, that has been closed off by some recent Supreme Court decisions in the US, but several European countries have begun to consider how their courts might hold companies accountable for violations that occurred outside their countries. The UK has been considering how to make these reforms, France, Switzerland. And this case against, for the Mariana Dam might be an example of this kind of initiative of how to reform practices to be able to hold companies that are listed on the UK Stock Exchange for violations that occur outside of UK borders. There's also been a shift internationally, efforts in the UN Human Rights Council to create a binding and enforceable treaty on business and human rights. This may be the beginning of a context that's making what had been overwhelming impunity, kind of closing that gap and allowing for some binding and enforceable norms on business and human rights. This was tried in the past. The UN draft norms was an effort led by Professor David Weisbrod at University of Minnesota to try and look at what human rights violation norms exist in law, in international law. But the UN draft norms were killed off partly because of a very powerful international business lobby. And we now have the Ruggie principles, as Stephen just mentioned. So that leads to my third and final point, which is how to overcome this powerful business lobby to make it possible in the failure of the kind of governance, corporate governance that Stephen mentioned. When that fails and there are abuses, how can businesses be held accountable? The power of these veto players were very active in the US, making it increasingly difficult, really gutting the use of alien tort statute. And this lobby in part had to do with the appointment of judges and election of judges who have ruled against the application of ATS in those cases. So the lessons I want to draw from these last 2 points about the human rights context and veto power is the importance of innovation. What I see in the Mariana Dam case is that Pogust Goodhead has really drawn on these advances being made in terms of developing instruments for corporate accountability for human rights violations, kind of, in a sense, building on this momentum that is happening international. And also using fora like this one that Canning House has presented and media attention to draw, to really inform about the abuses that have been carried out, the need for accountability to address the rights of victims, and information campaigns to raise awareness to the norms behind business and human rights. So just to quickly summarize, this is a very exciting test case to see if the UK courts will be able to advance justice for victims of corporate abuses in the Global South, to see if those courts can overcome the current absence of binding and enforceable human rights obligations on business, and to see if they can somehow overcome the veto power of business. I really want to applaud Canning House for making this case visible. I also applaud Pogust Goodhead for taking this case on, for being the kind of institutional innovators for the Brazilian victims, and for applying the needed international pressure that can act as a counterweight to the power of impunity. And last, but certainly not least, I applaud those in Brazil who, from below, have brought this case to international attention with prospects for future cases on behalf of victims of corporate abuse.
Lee, thank you. Thank you, everybody. We collectively overran a bit, but 4 very interesting contributions. So let's crack on. I mean, I've got some big themes, and let's try and touch upon them, concisely as we can. And they come out really of the points that have been made by all the speakers. The first one, can I explore with you all, is around corporate management. In other words, corporate responsibility, what procedures businesses put in place to ensure best practice. And I suppose on the sort of flip side of the same coin, the regulatory environment within which they operate. So Stephen in his contribution mentioned Aberfan, which of course is a very famous civic catastrophe in Britain almost 60 years ago now. But I think it's fair to say, I mean, you can never say, I suppose, anything with absolute certainty, but it feels like we're in a regulatory environment where that would not happen today. And lessons as a result have been learned. And so I'm interested in both whether the companies are making sure that they are doing everything they can to maximize the chances of avoiding catastrophic failures, and whether the regulatory environment in the countries across America, as Jorge would have it, but South America, Latin America, have tight enough, focused enough regulations to mean that they are also minimizing the chances of such catastrophes. Who wants to go on either or both of those bits? But let's keep them brief. Let's keep the conversation going. I mean, Stephen, as I mentioned you then, do you have any reflections on either of those two aspects?
Yes. So I've thought a fair amount about best practice in the management of tailings storage facilities. We acted as a co-convener of the Global Industry Standard on Tailings Management, which has 6 elements from, focusing on the affected communities or potentially affected communities, developing an integrated knowledge base, making sure that design, construction, operation and monitoring is up to scratch, that there is an independent level of review operationally and then at the governance level within companies, that there's a designated executive that's got responsibility for individual tailings facilities.
Stephen, how receptive do you find the businesses when you seek to probe into this, how effective they are in this regard? Are they?
Good question. I've got a nice answer for you. The larger mining companies have been very receptive. ICMM members, which includes BHP and Vale, for our purposes today, have both committed to adopt the Global Industry Standard on Tailings Management and to report compliance against the standard for their very high and extreme hazard category facilities by August this year. So we should expect to see a wave of disclosures from the mining sector covering extreme and high consequence classification facilities. So in terms of the 250 odd mining companies that we've approached in the major exchanges around the world, 70% of them have responded to say that they are adopting the GISTM or are reviewing the adoption. There are other standards. So the Mining Association of Canada has a good standard that's kind of relevantly similar to the GISTM. But the reason we adopted the GISTM was to create a standard that applies across jurisdictions, so that a global investor or a company that's operating globally can have the confidence that whatever the jurisdiction says, whatever the standard might be, if the GISTM is being applied, then there's a good standard of practice present. So strong response from the industry. We'll see the first reports coming out in August, and our hope and expectation is that we'll see site level verification, so audit and assurance at the site level in the public domain about in relation to the standard in due course as well.
And Lee, I mean, I'll come back to you, Caroline, in a moment. But I mean, if the industry is responding in a positive way, as Stephen says, I mean, is that due to them being governed by a high moral code, or is it due to them feeling that this is a necessary part of their business model to reassure investors and customers, or is it in response to NGOs like your guys, you know, sort of holding their feet to the fire, or maybe it's all of the above? And I suppose my question a bit is, does it matter really? I mean, ultimately, through a combination of processes, are we seeing higher standards than would have been the case certainly 8 years ago, but you know, going back 20, 30 years?
It's difficult to say whether we're seeing higher standards now than earlier because we have no baseline to go from.
Yeah.
But I do think that there are a number of practices that have been put in place by companies, either because of their own corporate accountability culture, or sort of corporate responsibility culture, that they want to project a kind of modern business that wouldn't carry out these kinds of activities. There's also pressure from stockholders, like the one I mentioned in the Volkswagen case, and also from, as you say, NGOs, international NGOs, like the anti-sweatshop campaign, for example, these sort of global consumer campaigns that do put pressure on companies. And I think the cost of litigation could begin to, I mean, you think about something like the Chevron case, that, you know, the cost of trying to litigate or avoid litigation in the case of many companies is quite costly. And while the argument on the other side is businesses can pass off the costs of litigation on to consumers, I think that the reputational cost is—
No, it's a big risk. I'd say it's a big risk. I mean, in financial and reputational terms.
Jeremy, I would like very much, if I can, jump here, because you mentioned something like if there would be a higher moral code that would be guiding this changes, if there are any. There isn't a moral code guiding the acts of board members, directors that are fiduciary directors for the shareholders.
I suppose.
So, I think.
Wait, I'll explain. But I suppose the point I'm making is, in life, can we assume that people only do the right thing because people are putting pressure on them? Maybe people want to do the right thing for good reason.
I'm not talking about bad reasons. We're not talking about people. We are talking about representatives of listed companies that have fiduciary duties and respond to their shareholders. So,
but they're people as well.
Yes, but they don't have a decision power individually, right? So this is a part of a corporation that are ruled by internal rules, corporate governance, but also regulation, and also respond to very specific forces that are external to the company. So the shareholders, the consumers, and some stakeholders, for example, employees, the society, NGOs, and those are play forces. So to say that there is a moral ethical code, this is something that is outside of the business theory of corporate behavior. So I'm just bringing a bit of academics. But what I would like to add to that is that this kind of litigation that we are putting, for example, for the case of Mariana, as Professor Lee just mentioned, has a very stringent effect of altering some of those pressuring forces. So because of the publicity, we are able to attract attention of NGOs, employees, and potentially consumers. This is not that relevant for a mining company because we don't choose as consumers if we are going to this or that mining company, right? It's a raw material. However, this kind of litigation does affect very directly its important stakeholder, which are the shareholders or the bondholders, because of the financial risk that it impacts. So there are two effects of this litigation. So one is respect of justice back to the clients, so those that suffer the damage. But another is a higher impact, and this is yet to be tested. I know that this is my line of research academically. Whether there are social impact and environmental impact arising out of this litigation, not only related to the client, to my clients and to the victims of the environmental disaster, but whether they would drive corporate change in the future. And that's what here we are trying to understand is in respect of this case is still unclear. But as Professor Lee said, we will have to start testing whether other cost litigation, just like the one against Chevron, change corporate behavior, therefore making this practice, specifically mining, more safe for everybody. And when I say everybody, I'm also talking about the financial investors.
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, the traditional sort of capitalist model that businesses have no moral compass and only serve their shareholders? I mean, all I ever hear from modern businesses is them permanently telling me how morally superior they are. You might think it's window dressing, but they have views on every single passing social benchmark of demonstrating what good people they are. I mean, when I was a younger man, you know, banks just did banking. Now they spend their whole time telling us what they think about, you know, every aspect of modern society.
But not because they're better, but because it costs. So in business, in the business world, what drives things is profits. And the fact that and it's not a critic. I'm just saying that it is a fact.
No, sure.
So I'm saying that because of first changing in consumer preferences, that for example now you wouldn't see in the past, now they do make a difference in the bottom line of the profit of the companies because of changing regulation. Because
let's get Jorge, I'm conscious I'm giving you. You presumably feel, and I'll come back to you, Stephen, then let's move on. You presumably feel, sorry, pointing, that the NGOs and others, you know, external actors are helping to drive the behavior of corporations in a positive direction. That left to their own devices, that shift would be either non-existent or less pronounced. Jorge, do you have? I mean, I'm putting words in your mouth, but I'm assuming that's your take on it.
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. I can have a personal opinion on this, but what matters is, for instance, I'd like to take the judgment of the United Nations Human Rights Council. They have concluded that the behavior from transnational corporations is not a moral behavior, and therefore, a few years ago, they resolved a resolution. The name of the resolution is, let me just give you the name, is resolution 26/9, which recognize how transnational corporations need strong regulations for governments to be able to make them accountable of the human rights violations. So on personal basis, I do not believe that companies have a moral compass or a moral behavior. That's not in their constitutional documents that they need to develop in order to create a company. You won't find in any of those companies in their legal status nothing related to human rights elements. It's just about shareholder profits and increasing of the market. So we can take a look at the resolution at the United Nations Human Rights Council, and that explains very, very clearly the position of government delegates at the United Nations.
Stephen, briefly, and then we can move on to something. Well, actually, I'll say briefly, but also I might come back to your regulatory failure by the authorities. Leave aside the businesses. let's say whether the businesses are moral or immoral or somewhere in between, and why they might be in those positions, one would hope and believe that competent regulation would prevent catastrophic business failures, and that it is seems to me it's a reflection of regulatory failure as well as business failure when a disaster of this type happens. But so reflect on, Stephen, either that or whatever other point you want to make, and then others briefly if you want to. Yeah, the flip side is not just the business practice, but the environment within which the business operates. Is the regulation, put it this way, could this have happened in any country in the world? Or are there lessons for the Brazilian regulatory authorities about why it happened in Brazil? Put it more provocatively, but come Stephen, to you first.
It has happened in a very large number of countries in the world. It happened in December in South Africa, a place called Jagersfontein. There was a tailings breach. It happens all over the world. These are large engineered structures, and they're some of the largest structures in the world. And they have a history of failure. The point I was going to make was kind of in response to the somewhat anemic view of ethics and human rights that being presented as how businesses think, and in the way that they are just focused on profits. Our view as a long-term investor bound by fiduciary duties is that we're interested in risk-adjusted returns over appropriate timeframes. Those risk-adjusted returns take into account social risks as well as risks to profit, downside risks that are relevant to the credit, a range of different considerations. Social license to operate, the kind of thing that a mining company can lose quite easily if there's a disaster, is a core archetypal social consideration that is a financially relevant data point that investors can take into account and do take into account and are increasingly taking into account. And in the light of that, it's perfectly reasonable for companies to act on human rights concerns, act on their social license to operate, to present a better governance rather than worse governance on human rights and community relations, even right down to the level of community relations. So the idea that business does profits and responsibilities, wider responsibilities, are relegated somewhere else, personal life maybe, I think is a mistake. I think there's a Freshfields report on impact investing, not just about designated impact investing, but in general, that goes through a number of jurisdictions on the room for investors to consider the wider impact of their decisions.
And essentially you can take a broader view or longer term view of profitability, which is a continued license to operate.
Indeed.
In other words, short term, it might even be that short term profitability is not, could not be the primary business concern compared to earning trust over a sort of medium to longer term time span.
Indeed, and for investors that have a broad sweep of investments, a universal owner, or if they're large enough to own a slice of every company in the world, then they will think very carefully about the externalities that one business creates that might harm other businesses in their portfolio. So that interconnected of business interconnections means that there's much more. I mean, the financial industry works on trust, and trust is a moral concept fundamentally. But I mean, those are kind of sideline points.
No, let me tell you, it's an interesting point. So let me do the others. I already said, if you regulatory inadequacies on behalf of the authorities rather than the firms, if you want to come on that. But I think it's an interesting and marginally provocative point, Stephen, that whether actually the greatest way that capitalism can be effectively regulated is through capitalism. That the greatest external force on, for example, big mining companies isn't social as much as capitalistic. I'm being a bit provocative because I think it's perfectly possible it could be both simultaneously.
So
but ultimately, some of these big asset management firms can BlackRock, I think you mentioned, just as an example. I mean, they can bring about social change. I mean, no one would describe them as an NGO, but they are agents for social change.
Jeremy, if I can say something. So I think that a distinction is important. We are here talking about listed mining companies. So it is true, very much true, that in the spectrum of impact investing or sustainable investing, we have those investors that we call concessionary. There are those that are willing to concede part of their profits for a greater goal or for a different goal that are not related to profit. And you have others that are just willing to measure risk. We have also those that are warriors, I would say, just like the engaged shareholders, just like the Stephen, that plays an incredible role, very important to the society to make their position, to stand for their voting. But we are here talking about one of the biggest mining companies, a multinational listed in 2 different countries. This company cannot, for regulatory purposes, be run by moral ethic codes that doesn't exist. It's we are talking here about corporate governance for those multinational.
I don't want to go the same ground again.
I've got another example which might be helpful.
No, but let's, because we're running out of time. So I'm gonna steamroll everybody because I want to cover one more subject and I want you to have a chance for the last word. And because we're a bit low on time, let's do the subject. The international aspect of the judicial, the legal response. Courts in an external country to where the disaster took place, taking a view and having jurisdiction. I think that is a very interesting. Sorry, I don't want to sound sort of too dispassionate about what was obviously a tragedy for people involved, but it is an interesting consequential. I think, isn't it? I invite you to. Does it matter? Does it have big ramifications? I'm particularly conscious that Lee and Jorge haven't contributed as recently, but we could even, if everyone's very disciplined, have a quick skim around if there's anything particularly want to add on that, and then some concluding words. But self-discipline on time, please. Lee, do you want to have a stab at anything that's come up?
Sure. I mean, I do think it's important to say that one of the reasons there is this veto power over having any binding international, binding and enforceable international law around business and human rights is precisely the argument that businesses are already self-regulating for the reasons you, Jeremy and Stephen, brought up before, that there are certain costs of not doing it. But that doesn't allow us to think about what in the case where self-regulation doesn't work, right? And you have these kinds of disasters. There has to be some kind of mechanism for the rights of victims of these kinds of disasters. And where we've gotten so far has not depended on businesses being the protagonists of defining what those binding and enforceable legislation is. It's been on the part of human rights advocates, activists, victims groups, NGOs, and others. I think we've only gotten as far as we have with sectoral agreements in certain industries and international agreements because of that activist element, not because of leadership in the business community, which is unfortunate. I think the business community could be a leader in thinking about what is acceptable behavior and what is not acceptable behavior on the international level that then can filter down to the domestic level. So I do think that there is crucial roles that can be played by cases like the Mariana Dam case in starting to have models of litigation that involve courts in the global north, for example, powerful courts in the global north that can resonate for other kinds of cases that happen in the next 10 years, because as Stephen says, these cases are happening all the time. It's not that we don't maybe have as much attention to them, but I think a case like this could really bring about a change and develop a kind of model, an innovative model for how to bring accountability for companies and to bring remedy to victims.
Thank you. Well, I think we're into a sort of later stage. So let's go, Jorge, Stephen, Anna Carolina, maybe some brief reflections from you each in that order. Jorge, do you want to go first or pick
Yes.
up any
Yes,
particular
thank you,
point?
Jeremy. Yeah, really quick, just trying to save some time. I think on the personal basis, a strong regulation is something that we need to consider globally. It's really hard to bring corporations accountable. And this is something that is being told in many different seminars within the United Nations system and also at the OECD. Because self-regulatory initiatives or self-regulation initiatives by companies are not the way to go. So yeah, let's not just forget that this is about affected communities from these companies. And thanks for the opportunity for bringing this issue into the light of a specific public. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Ana Carolina, any bits you want to pick up on? Sorry, after I cut you off a moment ago.
No. What I would like to focus is on this point, the importance of this kind of debate, of this kind of discussion. The mere fact that we are having this kind of discussions respect of if there is any moral ethics of business, what are the impacts of this kind of litigation, not only for the individuals affected, but for the whole company. And another thing is that specifically because it's a Canning House event, I would like to note that it is an important moment for the courts of England, for the UK, take the leadership also on this aspect. Just like happened in other occasions during the Industrial Revolution or even after the financial crisis in 2008, where actually the courts of England took the position to be the mediator party, to be the forum judging even disputes that were happening outside of their locus of market, therefore bringing something extra for this country. There is a reason why London is the center of the financial markets in the world, many of them, and one of them is the strength of the legal courts in England. Yeah. They have an opportunity to have the same for climate change.
Thank you. And Stephen, any reflection?
Yes, regulation is hugely important, but the thought of a single global regulation is somewhat daunting. That said, I support certainly support the increasing opportunity for international legal recourse where there are challenges, where there are disasters. I think that's got to be a positive step, particularly, because multinational enterprises operate around the world, across borders, and there are very few institutions that can operate at that level, go toe to toe with companies that operate across jurisdictions that influence regulation in all sorts of contexts. As a responsible investor, we've been working very hard on, not as a concessionary investor, but as a responsible investor with fiduciary duties, we've been working very hard on corporate lobbying practices and encouraging companies to review the way that they lobby governments and regulators and publish that information in the public domain. So the kind of the ecosystem of how regulations are decided around the world has a huge amount of corporate influence on it. And I think it's certainly of interest to all responsible investors and civil society to increase the scrutiny on those practices. So yeah, regulation is hugely important. And I think alongside the kind of dichotomy between regulation on the one hand, hard-edged regulation, and voluntary commitments from companies, somewhere in the middle you have responsible investors that are willing to sack directors of companies, publicly listed companies, if they misstep. If you look at the Rio Tinto example in Juukan Gorge in Australia, the CEO and the chair both lost their job alongside a number of executives because they exploded an indigenous site of very significant importance, 40,000-year-old evidence of human habitation that could still be linked to the local people, the PKKP people whose land it was. I mean, they relied on a 12-year-old agreement with the company, but they happened to explode that site in order to mine iron ore during a heritage.
There were consequences for it.
And there were consequences indeed, yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to wrap it up because I've always, it's always tempting to overrun, but people have dialed in with the expectation on the timings, as have the speakers. So we should try and maintain some discipline. Can I sum it up like this? I think interesting. We spent a lot of time talking about what motivates capitalists. And I suppose if you're a sort of pure Adam Smith capitalist, then you make a virtue of saying what motivates capitalists is profit and shareholder value. You know, bakers don't bake bread to be nice; they bake bread to make money for their families and themselves, and that in itself is a social good. What's quite interesting, I think, is that even ardent capitalists seem to be slightly moving away from what you might regard as a sort of narrow and pure definition of capitalism to consider their wider and longer term commercial interests and what's even called license to operate. Where I think our conversation then got more interesting is why, or what are the motivations or the external pressures that brings that to bear? You know, is it people within companies feeling that they have a higher moral obligation? Some of the speakers didn't have much confidence in that interpretation. Is it that they felt that the profitability of their business would be beneficially affected by engaging more constructively and rigorously with these processes? Or is it a result of external pressures from NGOs and others, customers sometimes, or legal pressures? And we can't be certain of the answer, and different people have different opinions. What it's worth, I think, may well be that all of the above play a contributory role. And then, of course, there's the interesting sort of international aspects that the big, and this is, I mean, I used to be a legislator. I was a member of the British Parliament. A lot of these big international businesses have a reach and a sort of dimensionality, if that's a word, that goes way beyond the jurisdiction of an individual legislature. But in the absence of sort of global governance, or truly effective and meaningful global governance, you have to think about how those businesses can be accountable for their actions, and that they should be held to the standards of the countries, often with greater rigor, put it that way, rather than those with less developed legal systems. I think that is quite an interesting ramification of this particular disaster. But anyway, that was my attempt to try and do a reasonably balanced and brief summing up. Thank you all of you for your insights and perspectives, all four of our speakers today. Thank you everybody for watching us. As I say, it was a slightly unconventional Canning House webinar, but unconventional can be good. We don't always have to be conventional, and I think it was, it's a subject worthy of attention, partly because the gravity of what happened and the environmental degradation caused by it and the impact on the individuals concerned, including those who died, obviously, means that it is a significant event that is worthy of ongoing attention, and partly because it throws up lots of interesting and longer lasting areas of debate and potential change and progress. So that was why we thought we'd have a go at it this afternoon, and we were massively informed in that process by the four speakers. So thank you in turn to all of you: Anna Carolina, Stephen, Jorge, Lee. Thank you to everybody who's been watching in the UK, Latin America, around the world. And we hope you can join more of our Canning House events in the future. Thank you very much.